Late one night in November of 1999, a 66-year-old minister named Colin Grant opened up the iron gates of a cemetery called Greyfriars Kirkyard. The cemetery was one of the oldest and most famous cemeteries in Edinburgh, Scotland. Colin, in addition to being a minister, claimed to be a psychic, and so the city, in desperation, had asked him to come to this cemetery tonight and perform an exorcism. There were two people with him. There was a journalist and a photographer from a local newspaper. Colin began cutting through the grass, passing by different headstones, on the way to perhaps the most infamous building in the entire cemetery, Black Mausoleum. The Black Mausoleum was this tall stone crypt that had been built sometime in the late 1600s, and it said George Mackenzie. Back in the late 1600s, George Mackenzie was a Scottish lord who worked for the King of England, enforcing the king's religious laws. There was one group called the Covenanters who hated these laws so much that they actually mounted a full-scale rebellion. This is when George Mackenzie came in. He captured over 1,000 Covenanters, and he marched them all into this huge field, which would later become the Greyfriars Kirkyard Cemetery, and for weeks he had these people starved and tortured and mutilated. Basically everybody in that field had been murdered in some horrible way by George Mackenzie, and their bodies were all dumped into a mass grave in Greyfriars Kirkyard. Hundreds of years later, a proper cemetery would be built right on top of that mass grave. And then when George Mackenzie died, they built him this beautiful mausoleum. 300 years after Mackenzie was buried, Greyfriars Kirkyard was quiet. That all changed though in 1998. A homeless man broke into the Black Mausoleum and he fell through the floor and landed in one of those mass burial pits. Right after this happened, visitors to the cemetery began reporting the same thing. Anytime they were in or near the Black Mausoleum, they'd get pushed or tugged on or scratched or burned or even strangled. Maybe when that guy fell through the floor, that had released George Mackenzie's evil spirit. The city was totally fed up with this, and so they said, let's just try an exorcism. Colin gets out his Bible, he pulled out 12 candles, and he put them in a circle on the ground, and Colin was inside of the circle, and he lit all these candles, and the whole time he was chanting out these Bible verses. And the photographer, Susan, she lifted up her camera, and right as Colin is passionately chanting out these verses, she takes a picture of him, and the second she does, the flash lights up the cemetery, and then after the flash goes away, Colin crumpled to the ground. And Colin, who's like barely conscious at this point, he just kept repeating, "This is going to kill me." And so Susan, she glanced down at her camera, and when she looked closely, she screamed. Here's the photograph that Susan took. As you can see, Colin the minister is standing there, and behind him is the big church. Nobody was inside the church at the time. There is a figure in that window looking out at Colin. After Colin collapsed to the ground, Colin would die inexplicably. No one has ever been able to debunk the photo that Susan took that showed that dark figure in the window of the church. To this day, that cemetery is considered to be one of the most haunted places in the world, and George Mackenzie's spirit, who supposedly haunts it, is considered to be one of the most dangerous poltergeists in the world as well.